And learn people that are here and also our Zoom friends and colleagues. We appreciate you joining. I'm going to close the door. Walk this outside. All righty, so we have the great pleasure and honor to have Dr. Grace Chen, who is an assistant professor, faculty fellow in the Department of Teaching and Learning at NYU. She holds a PhD in Learning, Teaching, Diversity from Vanderbilt University, and a BA in Psychology and Organizational Studies from University of Michigan. A former secondary school math teacher, Dr. Chen studies teacher learning around issues of race, power, and equity, with particular interest in identity, ethics, and affect. Her dissertation explored secondary mathematics teachers' ethical stances on relational work, in addition to academic research on teachers' attunements, teachers' pedagogical responsibilities, marginalization in mathematics education, and Asian Americans in STEM education. Her teacher-facing work on politics of teaching mathematics, building mathematical community in secondary classrooms, and refusing racialization has appeared in the Best of the Math Teacher blogs, 2015, Global Math Department newsletter, and as keynotes at Twitter Math Campaign, other professional development experiences. And she also co-founded the monthly Miseducation Asian Twitter chat, which I think is really good me. And Dr. Chen has already received a really impressive number of awards, including the recent 2022 Provost Postdoctoral Fellowship Program, Fellow at NYU. The Founders Medal for First Honors, Graduate School of Vanderbilt in 2021. Also from Vanderbilt, the Graduate School, the Auto Bachelor's Dissertation, Bachelor's Outstanding Dissertation Award, and a Peabody Faculty Council Equity, Diversity, and Inclusion Leadership Award. And she was also a National Science Foundation Graduate Research Fellow, which is quite impressive. Not a lot of those around, and it's an impressive accomplishment. So students who are interested in that kind of thing, I think would be good. And so today she'll be sharing work and thoughts around ethics and embracing the cool optimism of equitable mathematics teaching, which I love the title. I think is very provocative, and I'm really looking forward to hearing what you have to say and for all of us to learn from you. And so thank you for being here with us physically in this space. Really appreciate it, and handing it over to you.
Wonderful. Thank you so much for inviting me, and to Hama and Erin for coordinating and helping get me down here from New York. I am really excited to be here and to be in person with you all. And I'm looking forward to chatting. I did have a question. I'm sorry, I should have asked beforehand. Is there a way, folks have questions, like if the online audience members have questions in the chat or anything, is that?
Yeah, we'll do a Q&A towards the end, and we'll make sure that we get through all the questions.
Perfect, wonderful, thank you. So I'm excited to share this work with you all, and because I haven't had the chance to talk about it yet, so this is my first time actually like speaking out loud about it. And also there are pieces of it that are still a little bit in progress. I'm really looking forward to getting your thoughts, and so hopefully we'll have lots of time for discussion and Q&A. So I want to start with maybe a quick clip to frame what I'm going to be talking about today. And this is a conversation from a group of skilled veteran math teachers. They teach high school, they teach all grades, but they all teach Algebra 1 to first year students. And they have spent a lot of their practice really working on how to do group work really well and thoughtfully in their classrooms. So in each of their classrooms, almost the entire period is spent in small group work at the board. I don't know, how many of you are math folks in here? So like the vertical non-permanent surfaces, their students are up at the board the whole time. And so this is like a PD-ish, I would say a collaborative meeting conversation where they're really talking about what do you do when you've got a group of students but you're doing small group work, but one student is persistently excluded or one student is persistently left out. So prior to this clip, we've been watching video from their classrooms and talking about different strategies they've used. And this is a really short clip. It's just like a minute. And then I think that will frame what I'm talking about today, and we'll come back to this clip later in the talk.
I mean, I have a kid, he's resource, he's real quiet, doesn't returning homework, he tries really hard, he has a tough time talking to his group mates, so I don't want to just go in there and impose it on him, be like, look, you gotta talk, because it might feel awkward for him. So like, what's the agency there? Like, what do I do? Okay, so can you continue the sequence? Yeah. So I did it right next to hoping that like you would do this. Right there. Come on, come on.
That's what I thought was so interesting, because I think you deliberately, like, all the work was on that board. You came around to the outside so that he was part of it, and then he backed himself away. I don't know if you...
He's trying to give me space, I think. But yeah, I'm sure it made him feel a little uncomfortable.
And so after that, the other two students continue to do the thing that you hear the two of them talking about that, and he's still standing there, but you don't hear him say anything.
So what do I do, guys? Team.
I don't know.
I know the volume is a little quiet, but so basically, Frank, the teacher who's talking, is talking about a student, we'll call him Roberto, and Frank feels like Roberto doesn't have the tools to participate in the small group conversation. And so what Frank does is when he's working with that group, he actually stands physically and does the work close to Roberto so that Roberto has access to it. And it's actually farther away from the other two group members, hoping that that will give Roberto a chance to enter into the conversation. But Roberto sort of backs himself out of what's going on. So Frank is sort of like, I don't know what to do. And we'll look more at this clip in a little bit, but they start thinking about what do you do with a student like Roberto? How should you, what's the right thing to do? What's the responsible thing to do? I'm going to frame it as what's the ethical thing. So before we talk about that, I want to tell you a little bit about who I am and how I got to this work, because I think it shows a little bit of my orientations towards the kind of research I do. I always say that my motivation to get into education started with my grandmother. So both my grandmothers are brilliant people, really, really hardworking. Neither of them ever finished third grade, and neither of them ever learned to read. And that wasn't because they weren't smart, it wasn't because they weren't hardworking, but it was under a colonial government, multiple colonial governments, in fact, which limited their opportunities based on their ethnicity, their language, and their gender. And so that was sort of what motivated me to get into education, thinking about my grandmothers and what their lives could have been like if they had had opportunities. And I was a high school math teacher down the road, if we consider I-95 a really big road, in North Carolina, in rural North Carolina. And I taught high school math there to predominantly Black students, predominantly low-income students. And the work of teaching, I think, really helped me. It really made me feel, one, how complex it was, but also that like somebody should have figured this out by now. It showed me how brilliant students are, but also how hard it is for their brilliance to be visible in school, given all the constraints and limitations of schooling, and given all of the discrimination and oppression and various systems that my students were up against. So that work led me to teacher ed. I spent a good chunk of my 20s working for a nonprofit doing teacher education all over the country. So I've had the privilege of working in both urban and rural schools across the country, which has given me a real breadth of sense of like, what is schooling like in different contexts. And one thing that really struck me was that there was this hunger for teacher moves, for practices, for strategies. Like teachers wanted to know what to do. They had a sense that what they were doing wasn't good enough. They had these aspirations for equity or for a better, kinder, more humane math instruction for their students. And what they were craving was someone to help them figure out how. The other thing that struck me was that even when people developed teacher moves or strategies or practices that attempted to really honor the complexity of teaching, they were often taken up in very simplistic and reductive ways. Just because of, we know the constraints of schooling, like teachers are really busy, they have a lot to do. And it was really challenging to think about how those practices and how those moves made sense in their context for their kids, for their classrooms. This also really drove my interest in how teachers' identities and students' identities shape the work that you do in a classroom and how context dependent your instructional choices have to be as a teacher. Which led me to organizing in virtual and in-person spaces with parents and educators of color. And eventually, through Twitter, actually brought me to graduate school. So I went to Vanderbilt. I worked with Lonnie Horn, where we thought a lot about teacher learning, and she really helped me frame my interests and my curiosities through the lens of sociocultural theories of learning. I was really interested in thinking about critical theories and how we can bring all those together in the context of math education to understand how to create something better for the students who are in our classrooms every day. So that's sort of how I got to where I am and who I am as a researcher. I approach my work with a real sense of accountability to teachers. I take very seriously and very humbly the experiences that they share with me that they're willing to offer when they talk to me about their work. And I really want to honor that in my work. And I am also really interested in reading widely and interdisciplinarily to think both with theory and empirical data to try to help us wrap our minds around these really complex issues. And so what I'm going to talk to you about today is sort of bridging philosophy and learning sciences and math ed. I'm going to talk about what is cruel about equitable mathematics and why we should embrace it anyway. And this emerges from some work that started as part of my dissertation and comes from what Jackson and Mazzei call thinking with theory, or post-qualitative methods of working with theory and data to develop ideas. So I want to start by talking a little bit about relational ethics. And I think our traditional views of ethics tend to fall into a couple of like really common ways of thinking. Like there's ways of thinking about ethics that are really focused on virtue. So what is the thing to do that is honest, or what is fair, or what is loyal in this moment? We use ways of we use virtues to help us decide what is good and right, or what should be done. There's also consequentialist views of ethics that are focused on outcomes. So based on what is going to happen if I do this thing, what is the right thing to do? And then there are also more deontological views of ethics that are based on rules or principles. So if I have principles like do no harm, or do unto others the way you want others to do unto you, like deciding the right thing to do or the good thing to do or the moral thing to do should be based on these principles. I take the approach of relational ethics, which is a little bit different from each of these more commonplace ways of thinking about it. And relational ethics starts with a couple of basic assumptions. You can't really see it on the screen, but I've drawn a lot of Judith Butler's work. There are plenty of people who have written on relational ethics, but I find her to be a nice entry point, easy way to access these ideas. Relational ethics start with the assumption of exposure and vulnerability. So we are all always, already, and unavoidably in relation with other people as we go about our lives, as we move around in the world. And because we are all unavoidably in relation with people, we are all always exposed. We are all always vulnerable. But we're not all equally together. Our vulnerability is differentially distributed based on so many different things. Like in particular context, different people are more vulnerable than others. And sometimes this is based on things that we know, like racism, oppression. And sometimes it's more contextual. Sometimes it's about status. Sometimes it's about what's happening in a particular interaction or what happened that day. But Butler reminds us that often what conditions the differential distribution of vulnerabilities is a set of norms that exceed and precede us. So there are patterns and ways of being and ways that people interact with one another that aren't things that we originate from ourselves. They start with these histories and they still shape the way that we move through the world and shape how we're differently vulnerable. So with these assumptions in place, our relational ethics, it is really situated. It's deciding what is right to do or what is good to do or what we should do really depends. It is dependent on the context, on the people involved, on the specifics and the particularities of the situation, of the norms and the histories that are coming into play. And it's also really dynamic. What was the right thing to do last week might not be the right thing to do this week. What's the right thing to do first period might not be the right thing to do sixth period. And because of that, because of the dynamism of relational ethics, there's a lot of possibility in the moment to moment of not only responding to what we are encountering, but shaping what we are encountering. And it gives us the possibility to negotiate and to refigure some of these forms. So relational ethics are really concerned with what relations are being made possible as the like guiding question. So not just what virtue is at play here, what's the right rule to follow, or what are the outcomes, but also what relations are coming into play, what relations are being made possible when I engage in particular actions. And relational ethics, the thing I appreciate about it, why it's useful for me as a scholar and as an analyst, is because I think it really draws my attention to power. It really draws my attention to how people are affected by others and also affect others. And it helps us keep in mind I think sometimes there's always questions about like structure and agency and how do all these things happen when you're interested in studying like race and equity and power. And I think relational ethics help me really focus on recognizing that power is always at play and also everybody is agentically moving through those moments. So what a lens of relational ethics tells me is that equitable mathematics practices often exist in what Lauren Berlant calls a relation of cruel optimism. So she defines cruel optimism as a situation where the thing that you desire actually impedes your ability to get it. So when I think about equity in math education, there are many teachers who are striving for equity. They really want equity. Equity is really attractive. It's really important. It's really meaningful to them. And that can be true even when we don't really have a super clear idea of what equity means in our classrooms. Does it mean that all students are going to get the same scores on their tests? Does it mean all students are going to have equal access to learning opportunities? Does it mean all students are going to participate in the same ways or the same amounts? Even when the details of equity can be a little bit unclear, it's a really attractive force. It's something that teachers really want to strive for. And yet, sometimes this attachment to equity can lead us to do things that actually make equity harder to achieve. And that's what I'm going to try to talk through using the example of three really common like truisms or taken for granted practices in math education. And my goal is not to dismiss them. I am not here to say like we shouldn't be doing these things, but because I think the desire for a kinder, more equitable, more humane form of math education is really, really powerful. And so I'm going to come back around after this to talk about why I think we should embrace this cruel optimism and what it gives us to do so. But I also think we need to understand why things that are supposed to work don't work so that we can do better. So the first thing I want to talk about is the idea of getting to know your students. I mean, I think this is so well accepted and commonly understood in education. There is a ton of research literature, and I think many of us who have been in classrooms, whether as students or as teachers, know from experience that it's really powerful when teachers get to know their students. What the research in math ed tells us is that getting to know your students' identities as mathematicians and as racialized cultural beings can help build trusting relationships and lead to positive math learning experiences. I think the potential cruelty of this idea of getting to know your students, there are three sort of risks that come in taking the idea of getting to know your students as sort of a unquestionable good. One is the idea of conditionality. And this I draw from Derrida's work and Rutenberg's work on hospitality in education. And when there's a lot of focus on getting to know your students, sometimes there can be the idea that, or it comes sort of with a flip side maybe, or a dark side of assuming that teachers can only teach well if they get to know their students. There is a condition that students are only entitled to good teaching, or they're only able to access good teaching if they've made themselves known to the teacher. If they've revealed some personal information about themselves, if they've shared something about their cultural background or about their identity as a competition, there's sort of a condition that if students allow themselves to be known, then teachers can teach equitably and teach well. Which leads to the second dilemma, which is the potential for coercion. Kate Filippo writes about this. She has a very catchy title of a paper called something like "You're Trying to Know Me," and she writes about these high school students who respond to teachers' efforts for equity and saying yes, it's nice that our teachers pay us so much attention. I think they're working in the context of small schools, like the small school movement from about a decade ago. But also it feels like my teachers are trying to know me in ways that I'm not comfortable being known. And so there's always that risk for coercion that comes with I think it's very well intentioned, right? I don't think teachers are beating down students' doors being you have to tell me these things about you. But I think there's subtle ways in which things can feel coercive, like asking to fill out a survey and the student's I don't know if I really want to write down these answers. I don't really want to tell you these things. So I think that's something for us to be thoughtful of. And then also change. As human beings, we are always changing. We're always becoming different people every day. And especially I'm doing some work in a middle school right now, and I'm just reminded that when you're 12 years old, the 12-year-old you were on Tuesday may be totally different from the 12-year-old you are on Thursday. And so when we talk about getting to know our students, what version of them are we trying to know? How are we thinking about our knowing in ways that account for and accommodate ongoing change? So I think what relational ethics tells us about the idea of getting to know our students, one is that rather than thinking about getting to know students as a form of knowledge acquisition or collecting these facts, collecting these experiences, collecting these stories from them, is to think about knowing as an ongoing practice of attention, as a way of what Amin and Vafal call knowing as, they contrast knowing as, maybe I didn't write that down. I think what they suggest, I think they call it knowing as a relation in contrast to knowing as a commodity. So instead of thinking about the knowledge as these discrete gatherable pieces of information, is to think about how you are always in the process of knowing. And then a lot of the literature in the learning sciences talks about the importance of knowing norms and history and self and students. So it's not I as a teacher am this impersonal knower who has this information about students, but also, and Mujimini and I got to talk a little bit about this before we started today. For me as an Asian American math teacher, or sitting in my body, it means different things for me to ask particular questions of my students and to engage with them in particular ways from the white teacher down the hall or someone who embodies a very different social location. And so when you are aware of these norms and these histories that bound your relations with students and sort of take an understanding of yourself and how you are situated within them, it opens these possibilities for knowing that I think can start to address some of the potential cruelties that there are. So the next thing I want to talk about is cultivating student agency. Again, a truism in math education, we all think agency is lovely. We all think it's wonderful to work towards. Nicole really does a nice job breaking down the math ed literature and into different ways that people have thought about agency in writing it. And it's interesting because she does so in the context of a paper that discusses how teachers can sometimes reinforce hierarchy while striving for student agency. And so in the math ed literature, we talk about disciplinary engagement. We talk about giving students agency in terms of developing their mathematical competence. And of course, a lot of people, especially in social justice education, go back to Freire and the idea of students' agency in order to transform the world. I think one limitation that comes out of it is an idea of pseudo-agency. So Miller and colleagues in science education write about ways in which sometimes students are offered agentic possibilities or epistemic agency in classrooms only when what they are agentic about matches the constraints of the curriculum. So soliciting students' ideas for what we want to study in this unit, but then the teacher chooses the one that was in the curriculum all along. And so that's sort of a form of pseudo-agency where the agency that is being offered to students isn't quite as agentic as we would hope. And I think there are also other forms of pseudo-agency. One is the way in which sometimes we can, as teachers, can be really inviting of students' ideas, but only if we're controlling their bodies in a particular way. So I would love to hear what you think, but please stay in your seat, raise your hand, and use this kind of voice. And so there's a way in which agency is also restricted in that way. And there's also false choices. I'm sure we've all been in classrooms where we've heard like, you can choose to do this whole page of even problems, or you can choose to do this whole page of odd numbered problems. It's, kids can see through that. It's kind of a false choice. Another potential way to think about the cruelty of the idea of cultivating student agency is in narratives and discourses of empowerment. So Kayamura and colleagues, I think this has been written about plenty of times, but I appreciated this. The way that they framed how the idea of empowering students can sort of reinforce these ideas that the teacher is the knower, the teacher is the authority. They are empowering or giving, they're holding on to the power that they can then give to students. And finally, the idea of abandoning responsibility. I think even Freire says, if there's too much, in my role as a teacher, if I give my students too much agency, it becomes license rather than freedom. It becomes a license or latitude to do whatever they want. And as a teacher, I still have responsibility to my students to maintain a certain kind of learning environment, to direct learning in a particular way. And I think we see this with well-intentioned teachers who, through the aspiration to cultivate student agency, sometimes allow a little bit too much license in their classrooms in ways that can detract from learning. So I think the possibilities with thinking about agency include thinking about students as always agentic and asking, because students are agentic, and I think there's a lovely tradition in the math ed literature of thinking about how students who are whispering or like back talking like when the teacher is talking, they're sort of whispering to their friends, how what they're doing is actually contributing to their learning, or work on what is conceived of as off-task behavior or disruptive behavior. Some of Jenny Langer-Osuna's work is actually both agentic and also really meaningful as part of their participation in a classroom community. So I think that is one opportunity for us to be thinking about student agency, not just looking for it in the ways that it matches our perception of what student agency could and should look like. And Priyanka Agarwal and Tasha Singupta Irving remind us to link agency to accountability. So in their work on epistemic agency and disciplinary engagement, they ask, when students have agency in expressing particular ideas, how are we also encouraging them to be accountable to particular communities, to particular histories, and particular, like, what are they doing with their agency, and how are they also being accountable in that? And the last example I'll share is about equitable socio-mathematical norms. So again, for those of us in math ed, there's been so much literature on this. The promise of developing equitable norms is that it can cultivate agency and belonging and learning and identity development and lots of things that we want for our students as teachers. Then I think we also see ways in which attempts at establishing equitable norms can sometimes backfire or sometimes produce results that are the opposite of what we were aiming for. So often in group work, teachers try to assign roles to encourage that every student has an opportunity to participate. And sometimes we see these roles actually limiting or constraining students' participations. So I was in a classroom just yesterday where there were group roles, one student was assigned to be the recorder. They had the marker they were writing on the board. And sometimes students do that in really lovely and participative ways. And sometimes it becomes an opportunity for them to check out and let their classmates do the thinking for them. And they just sort of write what they're being told. group work and sociomathematical norms around participation can also reinforce status hierarchies. Again, we see some really lovely microanalyses in the learning sciences and math ed literature about how students' positionings can actually become reinforced through group work and through students sort of positioning each other as bossy rather than leaders or as smart in particular ways. And then there's also the risk of ossifying behavior. So when we establish particular equitable when we establish particular norms in the interest of equity, and we say to students, these are the ways we want you to participate, these are the ways we want you to ask questions, we run the risk of foreclosing other opportunities or other ways of participating that could also be really rich and productive and insightful. And so Alexis Shotwell writes about an alternative as really focusing on opening up normativities, really focusing on the process rather than the norm itself, but thinking about what processes are likely to open up opportunities for flourishing, for heterogeneity, for diversity in the classroom. And that can be a little bit risky. So the teachers in that clip at the beginning are really committed to random grouping as another example. So instead of assigning groups based on ability or based on personality or based on how well they would work together, they would pull cards every day and randomly assign students to their groups. And sometimes that resulted in groups that didn't work so well together. And sometimes that resulted in a little bit of a chaotic feeling classroom. But they also created many opportunities. I got to interview students in a lot of their classrooms who said things like, I didn't realize I could work with so-and-so, or it was cool to get to know this person I'd never talked to. And it created opportunities for students to learn to work in different ways, to try on different positionings and different ways of being in a group with other people. That said, I do think it's also important to note here that this isn't a call for relativism. And I think Shotwell also uses the phrase like, not everything deserves a future. There are some things that we know are not productive, that are harmful for kids. And that I think is our responsibility as teachers to be thoughtful about and to be aware of. But outside of that, I do think there's room for opening up more possibilities. So I promised I would say something about why we should embrace the cruel optimism of these equitable practices. And one of the reasons is because I think optimism itself is disruptive. So Berlant says that any object of optimism promises to guarantee the endurance of something or the survival or something. The flourishing of something, and above all, the protection of the desire that made this thing powerful enough to have magnetized an attachment. So when I think about the context of equity in mathematics or equitable mathematics practices, I think what Berlant is saying is that when we are optimistic that there is a kinder version, a more humane, a gentler version of math education that is possible, that attachment, protecting that desire is really important. We can't just abandon this because we know there's some problems with these practices and give up entirely. We have to maintain that attachment. And this is why I think it's important to embrace the cruelty, because this is not a naive optimism. This is not about ignoring the risks and the downfalls of what might happen if we're not thoughtful and careful about these equitable practices. It's about embracing the cruelty and creating opportunities for us to discuss those tensions and those risks and those dilemmas and think together about how we want to navigate them. So I also want to mention, in the context of inviting folks to think with me, I've been trying to figure out what this looks like in my teaching. At NYU, I taught a couple of courses. I got to teach an ethics and math teaching course last semester, which is really fun, where we looked at ethical dilemmas, we looked at situations, sort of like written case scenarios, and talk through like, what would you do in this circumstance? What information do you wish you had? And I think part of the challenge for teachers is often we don't have all the information we need. We wish we knew more context. We wish we knew what would happen. We wish we knew what had happened last period. But we still have to make a decision without that information. And so how can we navigate those situations? What tools do we have at our disposal? And how can we develop habits that make it easier for us to respond in ways that align with our values when we don't have the information that we want? In my elementary math methods courses, I've tried to, when I'm introducing these equitable practices, tried to do this with some nuance, which I think is tricky because I think aspiring teachers, again, sometimes are craving that certainty or that concreteness of like being told what to do. And I think it's tricky to both say, here's a thing that I think is really, really important and problematic, but also you should still do it, but also try to be thoughtful about it. Like that's just a lot to fit into a limited amount of time and space. So it's definitely something I'm still working on. And I'm currently teaching a course called the Sociopolitical Context of STEAM Education. And one of the things that we're working on is, as we're doing these readings about sociopolitical context and theory, trying to situate ourselves with them and trying to link them back to our math autobiographies or our STEM autobiographies, and thinking about like when we talk about racism or racial hierarchies in mathematics, how do we situate ourselves within it? How does that shape our teaching? And so those are just some of the things that I've tried, but I would really love to hear from all of you. What else should I be trying? What have you tried? Like, how else can we think about this together? And then I want to come back to this case a little bit, because I think what this offers us is a glimpse into how teachers actually talk about these ethical dilemmas. And I think what keeps me coming back to this clip over and over, I'm just going to share like a rough gloss of the conversation. But I think what's so interesting to me is because for me, it represents an example of both how teachers can be a little bit limited by the equitable practices paradigm, and also how they're trying to raise and resolve tensions within it. So I'm just going to talk through this is like a 15-minute conversation that I'm trying to summarize in 3 slides. So they're talking about Roberto and what to do when one student is persistently excluded. Excluded is even, I don't know if that's even the word I want to use, because excluded seems to convey a little bit of intention. And I don't know if I don't want to attribute intention to Roberto's group mates, but Roberto is sort of physically a little removed from the conversation. He doesn't speak up very much within it. And so the teachers are discussing, and one teacher says, well, if you gave him 10 minutes and someone to work with, could you just have him focus on the first problem? Because that's achievable for him. We think that's something he could do with a lot more time. What if we did that instead? But then they say like, well, we don't want to track our grouping. And what is he getting from standing there and listening to his classmates talk about it versus sitting there and staring at that problem by himself, or even staring at it with a partner? They say like maybe pull him aside with another student who's also struggling. And Frank says, but like even that is still singling him out. I think students are very sensitive to why some students are being pulled in certain places and not others. And another says, well, what if we keep him in the group, but we make him write? Like he just is responsible for recording what other students do. And then Frank comes back and says, but maybe that's like you forcing him to do something he doesn't want to do. So here they're really wrestling with Roberto's agency and what does it mean to respect Roberto's agency while also attending to his participation. And I think they very much subscribe to the theory that participation is learning, that learning doesn't always happen just by standing back and passively learning. There has to be some sort of active contribution. And so they're trying to figure out how to reconcile these dilemmas. Another teacher says, what if you have them self-select? What if you break up the room and you say like, everyone who wants to talk about number 1, come work over here. Everyone who wants to talk about number 2, come work over here. But then they start talking about the social dynamics that creates, or like, oh, I saw my friends go over there, so I want to hang out over there. Or, well, I don't want to be associated with these kids. They bring up status. Students who might say like, well, maybe I really need to work on number 1, but I don't want to be associated with the kids who are working on number 1. So here they're they're attending more to the relational dynamics as well, not just between them and the student, but also students and each other, and how different students will perceive and understand their pedagogical choices. And then here comes another suggestion, like maybe pull them aside and say like, why don't you just work on number 1? Then what does that mean for how you grade the homework? Or what's stopping another kid from saying like, why isn't this fair? Like, why does one student have to do this and I have to do something else? And then Frank reframes the question and he asks, do you think Roberto is getting something from standing up there with those two? And his colleagues disagree. Some of them say like, no, I don't think so. Some say, yeah, maybe a little bit. And one colleague brings up the idea that maybe we're meeting a different need, which is allowing him to be near and participate in a low risk way. So setting aside the question of what Roberto happens to be learning about sequences and series, what social needs are we meeting for Roberto by allowing him to continue to participate in this way? There's another proposal, like when I will come back, I want Roberto to be explaining number one. And how does that make Roberto feel? Thinking about students' feelings or students' experiences of these instructional choices as a consideration for how a teacher decides what's right to do or what they should do. And does it matter if that's your norm? Like if this is just about Roberto or if it's about the whole class, setting the expectation that as a teacher circulates among groups, telling them, I want you to explain number one, I want you to explain number two, I want you to explain number three. How does that change the implications or the consequences of what's happening here? So I think this example, again, the teachers keep bringing up new strategies or new ideas to try to help Frank figure out how to respond to Roberto and what to do. And I think in their conversation, you start to see some of the ways they raise these tensions and dilemmas and bring in the relational side of it. They're considering power, they're considering the relationships among students, the relationship between the teacher and the student. And I actually I've done like microanalysis of this clip for other purposes, but not for this purpose yet. So I would love if you have like methodological suggestions too for how else I might think about this conversation in the context of understanding relational ethics. So that's what I've got today. I would love to hear like questions you have or what that makes you think. Like I said, this is my first time trying to talk through this. There is a paper version of this, which is forthcoming in a book, but we know that books sometimes take a while to get published. So I'm happy to share it if anybody would like to read that. But I'm very much trying to grapple with right now with like, what does this look like to do empirically? And in my teaching. And so I would really love to hear thoughts. So thank you.
We have questions on Zoom.
We do have at least one.
We have one.
Go
Sharon, do
ahead,
you want
Aaron.
to share?
Should I close the slides so that they?
I can read it if they don't want to. They asked, they know about STEM and STEAM, but they wanted to hear more about STEAM with the E on the end.
That's something that NYU does because we also have an environmental education program. And so it's science, technology, engineering, math, and environmental education. It's also not an acronym I was familiar with before I got there.
I have a question as well from the ethics background. I really enjoyed your discussion about the different kinds of ethics and specifically the point about this not being relativism. I was wondering if you could say a bit about what is the relationship in your mind between relational ethics, care ethics, and is there a concern about this being too like leaning into our sort of non-universalizing interpersonal relational side too much and like losing some of the universality that prevents us from, it being like too much of a favorites or something like that kind of issue?
Yeah, I think that's a really good question. It's something I've struggled with in my own work. I think I started with care ethics, and what eventually moved me towards thinking about it through relational ethics and through scholars who write about relational ethics is when I think the care ethics literature, there's certainly absolutely exceptions, but I think my understanding of the bulk of it is that there are ways in which care ethics is not always quite as attuned to the political structures that constrain how we can care and who we care for and what it means to care. And I think that, again, there's certainly exceptions I can think of, and people talk about like politicized care. But I was looking for something that was that attended more explicitly to not only the positionings and the situatedness of the people doing the caring, but also the sort of social and political implications for care. And so Alexis Shotwell actually writes about care as a form of protest, which is something that I found really useful in my own thinking. Like, how can care serve as a form of protest against the injustices of the world? And it comes in who we care for and how we care, especially when we choose to care for those and care in ways that have not traditionally been acknowledged as care or as being worthy of care. So I think there is a lot from like care ethics that is useful. I think what the relational lens offers is just a little bit more of an explicit attention to some of that political and the desire for working towards a more just version of the world. And also, I think there's a lot of push in relational ethics to not just think about people, but also to think about the more than human and other than human. And that is something I'm still like exploring and figuring out what that means in my own work when I work in schools with teachers and students. But that's something that has also sort of drawn me towards that direction of thinking.
That's really helpful. Thank you for that distinction. Can I ask a follow-up question? Unless somebody else has a hand up there. I can't see everybody. Okay. How would you, so like, would that mean in terms of like moral foundations theory, you see relational ethics as like prioritizing equity or fairness a little more than care? And like, what is your understanding of relational ethics view on the like quote unquote relational moral foundations of like, loyalty and authority and purity? Do you think that like we should weight those more than like the sort of standard liberal mindset might?
That's a really tough question. I don't know if I have a good answer to that. I think what is useful for me about relational ethics isn't necessarily like, I don't know if it has to come at the expense of some of the more traditional ways of thinking about it. Like, I think when we're thinking about relational ethics and when we're thinking about how these relations of power and these norms and these histories shape the choices we make, and they shape our understandings of what is like right and good or what is possible. I think that is still informed by things like fairness or loyalty or these more traditional ways of thinking about moral foundations. So I don't think it's an either or, like I don't think they're mutually exclusive, but I do think it is more of where the emphasis is. And I find that I think part of the reason that drove me away from some of those traditional ways of thinking about ethics is that when I was thinking about actual classroom situations and actual classroom dilemmas, they seemed to fall apart very quickly. Like, it was hard for them to account for the messiness and the reality of like how your answer would change if you just had one more piece of information or if you just considered another piece of context or something else that was relevant. So I don't think I'm answering your question, except to say that I don't think they're mutually exclusive. I do think relational ethics, like where the emphasis is and where the priority is understanding how these norms and histories and power relations shape the choices that we make, even though we may also be making them based on our understanding of particular virtues or our understanding of the consequences of a particular action or our understanding of particular rules that we want to follow.
So
that's very helpful. Thank you.
Thank you, Erin. So I've been thinking a lot about what you're saying in relation to other things that are buzzing around in my mind right now and the ethics associated with that. And I think that part of the issue here, I like the idea of the optimism, right, that you mentioned, because I think that one of the gut reactions, and I think a lot of people have this gut reaction, is like, oh my gosh, it almost seems like no matter what I do, we heard this rhetoric, right? No matter what I do, I'm gonna harm. So maybe I just essentially end up doing what I do naturally and ignoring the fact that that is an equally, political stance and way of interacting. And I'm wondering, how do you support teachers are in understanding, sort of deeply understanding this notion of optimism. And reconciling the idea that you're probably going to cause harm in your best intentions, and as you muddle through the situativity and dynamism and all the nuance that's involved here, how do you keep yourself from getting disparaged and continuing and learning from these efforts, especially when it's hard to say what exactly are you learning given the situativity, dynamism, and changing nature?
Yeah, I think that is such a hard question. And I'll share like how I'm currently thinking about it, but I would love to know how other people think about this. Because I think this is also me wrestling with like, what is my role as as a teacher educator? Because I have theories about why it is worth still being optimistic nonetheless. But I do think that especially for pre-service teachers who are entering the profession, like nobody enters the profession because they think they're going to do harm. Like people enter the profession with great hope and great optimism and great, like, I want to do what's right for kids. And so the reckoning with this idea that like sometimes you probably will do harm. And also there's like what you do in your classroom matters, and it's not going to end racism. I think is really hard for teachers sometimes because it is I think it requires an acceptance of the sort of non-ideal situations of our world. I think people approach that in different ways. I think when I think about people I know and also people I've read about, there are people who throw that energy into like political activism. There are people who find like religious faith is the thing that helps them reconcile that tension. There are people for whom it's philosophy. There are people for whom it's like very hyper-local theories of change in terms of like, what can I do for my kids in my classroom that is making a really significant difference in their lives, even if it's not changing these longstanding relations across the world. And I don't have a stance on which of those theories of change is more useful or more helpful. And I sort of feel like if I did, it wouldn't be honored. Like, I think that's something teachers need to work out for themselves, because it is going to be so personal and so different for everyone. But we wake up every morning, right? We're aware of the injustices in our system. And yeah, we wake up every morning, we go to work. And I think that's the question I really drives me in my like scholarship and in my personal life. Like, how do I wake up every morning and go to work knowing what I know and make these choices? And I think the challenge of, like you said, the learning is hard to like chronicle because it's not like, oh, I figured out how to deal with this situation. Check. Like next time I have a situation, I'm going to do the same thing, because it is dependent. But I do think, again, something I'm interested in thinking about more empirically, but the idea of like shifting our habits and our attunements around the things that we pay attention to and the things that we notice. Because I do think that sometimes these ethical dilemmas are very conscious, deliberative dilemmas. Like, we hear Frank with his colleagues being like, what do I do? I'm debating, I'm discussing, I'm sort of listing pros and cons and possibilities. But I think often it's a lot more inherent. And it's like all of our choices are ethical choices, whether we're aware of them or not. Like everything we're doing is a statement on what we believe could or should be true, or what could or should be possible. And I don't know if the answer is to make everything cognitive and deliberative, because that is just so much mental load for a teacher. But I do think there are ways that over time we can develop our habits or our instincts or our intuitions to be more in alignment with what we might have done had we had the opportunity to cognitively deliberate around them. So that's a hypothesis I have. But yeah, that's just how I'm currently thinking about it. But I would love to hear what other people think about that too.
I'm curious, in that final discussion, where the teachers were raising different issues, and it seemed like most of them were kind of getting shot down for one reason or another. It's hard to hear like the tone of that conversation, because I've been in some spaces with teachers where teachers are kind of, well, you could do that, no, you could do this, no, and like, so I don't know if I have that kind of sense about it, but I'm also curious, partly because of this kind of the philosophical stance, like the degree to which teachers are understanding the broader power structures that are like impacting that conversation? Like, are they aware when they kind of raise something that broader like narratives of race are kind of impinging on their conversation? Like, are they conscious of that in the moment, or was that made conscious? So I'm kind of curious about the dynamics of that conversation. And I think one of the things that's kind of interesting is you can see these broader structures kind of impacting this conversation. I just don't know how like conscious the teachers are. And like you're saying, that might not be totally important if they're conscious like in the moment, but it does provide ways to kind of raise those. Like we were just considering X, Y, and Z as impacting this dynamic within this group and with the teacher and stuff. So I'm just kind of curious about the nature of that conversation, and also how you're unpacking it as you write this up, that this kind of approach allowing you to kind of see structures in a relational way rather than, because we can see relational just really just two people and ignore the broader kind of power too.
Yeah, I think that's a really good question, and a question I don't have an answer to, but it's one I've been thinking about a lot. Because I'll say this is a group of teachers that they're like extremely friendly. And so the tone of it is like, it's not like, excuse me, it's not like, no, that won't work. It's more like, yeah, but what if? And so they're really like working it out together. And I would say that they're a group of teachers who, not in this conversation, but in other conversations, talk very explicitly about equity and caring about it, but in ways that I think, as is true of many equity conversations, can sometimes feel kind of general. Like, yes, we all want equity. Like, yes, we all want agency. Like, yes, we all want these things. And what does it mean for each of us? And I tried to, when I was interviewing the teachers, tried to dig a little bit deeper into like what some of their motivations were, like why they cared about equity, or like what it was. And I found, this is my dissertation, so there are many things I would do differently if I could do it over. But I think it was hard for them to put into words some of these connections. So for example, Frank, the teacher who's teaching, something that's really important to him is that he grew up in the neighborhood that his kids live in, and he still lives there. He doesn't share their racial identity, but he very much shares a neighborhood identity with them. And so he would answer my questions with, like, I'm from here. And I was never able to get him to articulate like what it meant to him that he was from there. My inference on it is that is some of where the political commitments come in. And he would talk about how he was from there, but he had gone to a private school, like he'd had to leave his neighborhood and go to a private school. And that wasn't the education his students were getting. That's why he chose to come back and teach at the school. And so I think the political was like there. I don't think it's like me projecting onto them, but I do have these methodological questions, both in data collection and in analysis. Like, how do I surface it when it's not in discourse, like when it's not the words that they're saying? Like, how do I make claims about what is present for them and how that's shaping the conversation? Yeah.
It's hard.
Yeah. I think we're at time. I have a lot more questions. Maybe we can talk over. And I think this is really important work, difficult work, nuance. I think that the key, a lot of what I'm sort of picking up from here and in general around equity and justice work is the real importance of attending to nuance despite our intuition to simplify and act and, keep things more, black and white, so to speak, right? And I think it's important to keep that in mind and help others understand that. So thank you for sharing.
Thank you so much for having me here.
And next week,
We have
Mary.
Mary
that's
Curran,
right.
yes.
Yeah, Mary next week. So Mary will be here. So please do come. We'll have wonderful guests as well, also in person, so please do come. Yes. Thank you so much.